Welcome everybody to Theology Thursday,
Good morning.
round 2. I think it's the second week in a row I've made a mistake with the recording. We've had to do it again.
Do it twice.
So we have been talking about ministry, and last week we talked about that ministry is serving. Well, we talked about that the first time actually. Ministry is serving, and it's for everybody all the time.
And we looked at a ministry word, deacon, last time, with the idea of servant. A deacon and a doulos, remember?
Right, the slave, right? Yeah, I remember that. So we're going to continue with the theme, Dave. What are we talking about?
The Great Reformation within the church in the 16th century.
Yep.
It was led by people like Calvin, Luther, Zwingli, Knox. They saw the idea of the priesthood of all believers, and they began to teach that in the Protestant churches that the Reformers actually established.
So where did they get that idea from?
Fortunately, straight out of the Bible.
It's in the Bible, right?
And that was something about the Reformers, because they were coming away from the tradition and going back to the Word. And in 1 Peter 2, it talks about being living stones, being built up as spiritual temples and holy priests.
Right. And then, that's verse 5, right?
In verse 5, then 9, it talks about us being a separate people, a nation chosen, a holy priesthood.
Yeah, and some versions might say a royal priesthood.
A royal priesthood.
So who's he writing that to? Who's Peter writing that to?
And clearly Peter was writing to the whole church.
To everyone, right?
That certainly wasn't to some special
not just the pastors.
So it wasn't just some special group.
So we're all priests.
Yeah, we're all priests, and that's the thing that we really need to get into our head. We are actually all priests, all ministers, all servants.
Right.
So unlike the old covenant, where only the high priest could enter God's presence, and in the very holiest of holies, and only then he could do it once a year, every Christian can enter the heavenly holy of holies because of the once-for-all sacrifice that Jesus made on the cross.
So Jesus was the game changer.
He was, absolutely.
Yeah, so before him, God himself told Moses, I need a priest, right? Yep. That would be Aaron. So Aaron appointed his brother Aaron. Moses appointed Aaron. And Aaron was that middleman between God and the people. Yep. So he would represent God to the people. He'd tell them what God was saying. And then he would pray for intercede for the people.
And he would bring sacrifices.
And he'd represent the people to God, and he'd bring sacrifices, like you said. So he was that middleman. Then Jesus comes along and says, but I want all of you to be middlemen. I want you all to represent me to the world around you, and to pray for the world around you to me. Represent them to me. Be that middleman.
So the Old Testament, the Old Covenant, required physical sacrifices, the blood sacrifices, of lamb, doves, bulls, and goats. But because Jesus became the once forever, the eternal physical sacrifice, and his shed blood satisfied God's righteous judgment, and that was for eternity,
of course.
Then the sacrifices that we bring, and we still bring sacrifice, but what we bring, spiritual sacrifices, praise, thanksgiving, all of those things, we're bringing that sacrifice of praise.
Well, hang on, pause for a minute here, Dave. This is new for me. I've heard of all. Obviously, I've read it all, and I've always thought, Jesus is the final sacrifice, and we're told you don't have to make any more sacrifices, but
we do.
But we do, and we talk about it. We even mention, I'm making a sacrifice of praise, sacrifice of thanks. I like that. Like in the Old Testament, they brought actual animals, an ick, and then now in the New Testament, because Jesus has been sacrificed once and for all, our sacrifices are different. We're still priests, so we still offer these spiritual. So I like that, Dave. Talk away. Keep going. Lead on.
So the ministers of the New Covenant are not some special priestly class or tribe like Levi. Instead, it's every believer.
Right.
And one of the Old Testament roles for a priest was to intercede on behalf of the people. But now we do that for ourselves, but we also have the priestly duty of interceding for others, for one another, in our prayer and in practical ways
and our world, even not just fellow Christians, but everybody. We bring out everything we find in our world, the challenges and things we face. We can bring them to God on behalf of other people.
Yeah. The Reformers also taught that Christians serve God through their secular work, their vocation, their calling, as well as through their involvement in church. So Paul
Right.
taught the Corinthian church that whatever you do, you
Everything.
do it for the glory of God. So everything that we do, whether at home, church, shopping, driving the car, going to school, uni, whatever, our secular job, everything that we do it with the heart of a servant of God. So we're doing it as though I'm not working for Woolies, I'm working for God, and I just happen to be located there.
Yeah.
So we whatever we do it with the heart of a servant of
Yeah.
God.
Yeah, I'm always on mission. I'm on point.
Yep.
I'm a secret agent, you know, like, yeah, this is my secular job, but really I'm an ambassador for Jesus. And we did flesh that out a fair bit last week, you know, that it's full-time 24/7 service
And that's
to
an
God.
act of worship.
Yeah.
That's an act of worship to God. We are His doulos, His slave. We are full-time ministers
Yeah.
in His service.
You know, Paul says, we let us offer our bodies as living sacrifices.
That's right.
This is our spiritual act of worship. That's what it means.
So this is fundamental to the teaching of the New Testament. Christians are commanded to serve one another. No word for service or ministry in the New Testament restricts any act of service or ministry to what's known today as the ordained clergy. The ordained are ordained or set apart by man to fill a particular role or function.
Right.
But we are all ordained by God to serve one another.
So
and
as
to
for
serve
me,
Him.
as the pastor of New Life Church Nambour, I'm not some special, you know, like,
That's it.
you know, like an Old Testament priest that's been set apart and not different. And I am set apart, but then so are you. We're all holy. We're all set apart to serve God. I do it by helping facilitate the ministry of the church and the family and the community of the church. You do it by working at Woolies or in your office or at your school or wherever you are, but we are all His servants.
Yes, we're all one body. God called us all to ministry. We should minister to one another's needs to enable us to do this well. God has given us abilities so that we will use these that will help us in our service. And we'll talk about that later. But the big picture is that all Christians, whether men, women, young or old, new Christians or old Christians, are called to be ministers. Ministry can and should include ministering to the physical, emotional, mental, vocational, financial needs of others. Jesus did it, and so should we.
Yeah. So it's everything, all the time, everywhere, we're on.
Yep. If we take a look back at history, we can see why this special class of ministers, this clergy, was ordained and set aside by the church. The structure
That's
of the,
right. Like you said, I mean, there are several reasons, and you know, I would say primarily they couldn't get away from the Old Testament model, where you know there's the one guy who's set apart to represent God to man and man to God. He's the priest, and so you know the church sort of took on that model, and they didn't see it's in black and white. You know, Jesus saying, "You're all a royal priesthood now. You're all my." They couldn't see that, but there were other factors as well that sort of, I suppose, pushed people back to that model.
Yes. The structure of the church was quite basic. It was functional. It was simple. A group of Christians met or assembled together in what we then called an ecclesia, or a gathering, an assembling of people. What we would today call a local church congregation.
Yeah.
A group of elders were appointed because of their maturity or experience of Christian service. And Paul laid out qualities that were needed to be seen in a person appointed to that sort of a role. And this group of elders, or presbyters, was the Greek word, and we still use that in English today. They held governmental leadership role of the church, and often, and particularly in the Gentile type churches, a leader, a single leader, would rise from that group as the overseer, and that came out of Greek culture. We don't have time to go there, but we translated that into the New Testament as bishop, as overseer, one who, episcopo, who looks over and watches over the congregation. bishop, this episcope, was the only literate person.
Probably, yeah, the only one who could read.
And so he was the only one that had access to the scripture and to the writings of those that were regarded as the church fathers.
Well, yeah, we can, like in today's day and age.
It's hard for us to imagine.
It's hard, exactly, because even before the internet, libraries and we were all taught to read, and it's just it was a human right basically that we can all read. And now, of course, you've got all this information that was once like locked up in libraries that only only the real elite academia could access. Now we can all do it. Just it's on our phone if we want it. So back then there was one guy that could read.
Yeah. And in some instances, even the local leader was illiterate, and he had to rely on another leader in his region for understanding of scripture.
Right. So the bishop could read, but the priests couldn't. They just, what should I tell them this week?
Well, that's how it happened. And in these instances, it's easy to understand why the literate would exercise control over the illiterate.
Right.
And so that would mean that the literate leader would become the leader of several churches instead of just one.
The bishop, right, yeah.
And that's how the idea of our regional bishop came in. And some of
like
these,
you said, it does make sense. Which one of you can read? Right, you're the boss because you can read you can read the Bible.
Some of these literate leaders gained regional control or authority over groups of churches and demanded respect to be the church father or the papa.
The Pope.
And that's where that comes from. And thus we know today a diocese led by a bishop. That's how they began to form. This literacy issue led to doctrine that insisted that, one, and this is important, the church alone could understand and interpret the Bible.
Right.
That was the doctrine that developed because it was true at that stage. The church, in fact, one in the church, the only one who could read, could read and interpret the Bible. And it then was added to that the church tradition stands alongside the Bible as a basis of Christian faith and practice. And so those two things together began to drive the church. And by the time of the Reformation, it was very common to find that many priests, and people go, what? But many priests had never read or even held a Bible in their hand at the time of the Reformation. Astounding.
Because the printing press came around that same time.
Yeah, Gutenberg.
So before the Gutenberg press, there was not like you could just pick up a Bible at your local bookshop. They weren't around. They weren't being printed. People couldn't print stuff. Books before were written out by hand.
And ultimately, in 1053, the Church of Rome claimed absolute supremacy of its bishop over all churches and secular authorities, claiming that Peter was the first universal leader of the church.
And that's the Pope, right?
And that's the Pope. And they said that Jesus had established the church on the foundation of Peter, upon this rock.
Right.
But Jesus was not talking about
that's not how we would interpret that verse, right?
He was talking about the confession of Peter. And that Peter passed his authority down by episcopal, by this overseeing ordination, laying on of hands in an unbroken line. So I lay hands on you, you lay hands on him, he lays hands on somebody else. And so this unbroken line from Peter comes down into the church. So Peter ordained one person who passed it on basically down the line. It's known as apostolic succession. One of the problems with this whole idea is that there's actually no biblical record of Peter even going to Rome other than to be executed. And when the Gospels ended, Peter's actually in Jerusalem. And even later, when Paul writes to the church in Rome, he specifically mentions a bunch, but I think it's 27 he actually mentions, and he doesn't mention Peter.
Now, I haven't done as much research on this as yourself, but is it not possible that, like 300 and something years after Jesus, around 350, this is when Emperor Constantine, the emperor of Rome, becomes a Christian, converts to religion. So he takes on that mantle in Rome, which is his main city. So that's when the power sort of shifted to Rome as a city,
Absolutely.
and since then it's been the centre of the Catholic Church.
He declared himself as the one who was the bridge to God. Because he was now a Christian, he couldn't claim to be a god anymore, which was the right of every Roman emperor. So he said, no, I'm not a god anymore, but I'm the most important man there is. So if you want to talk to God, you've got to come through me. So he established that because he was the emperor of Rome. But the whole structure, because of the inability of Christian individuals to be able to read, and as literacy rates begin to increase, the church said, well, we're going to ban people from reading the Bible.
Because they'll start questioning us.
So it's crazy when you look back at history. So ministry became the domain of a select few, rather than the whole church. The minister became a person in the church instead of a function of the church. But without access to the Bible to teach, it's easy to see how that comes about. You just believe what your leader says.
Yeah. I've heard it many times, even in my own family, where they say, "Oh, we're not qualified to read the Bible.
Yeah.
We just trust the priest of our local church to tell us what it says and to interpret it for us."
So that the true church became a weak institution, but the visible church became a corrupt and powerful force, further entrenching in power and motivating those people that we were talking about to ensure that their system and structure didn't change. So they protected their own personal interests. And with the Reformation, there came a rejection of that whole notion of apostolic succession and the supremacy of individual churches, and with that eventually came access for every believer to the Bible and an acceptance of the concept of every believer priesthood, that the ministry function of every believer. So, back to the question, what is ministry?
It's service. We know that from last week.
Consider for a moment what it means to say that we're created to be God's children, born of God, as it says in the Gospel of John. God does not create us to be good workers or servants for him. He does not merely create us to become good moral beings here on earth, but he does something far more important, far deeper, far more special. The way that the Bible talks about the relationship that God intends to establish with us is that of family, not an economic or legal relationship. We are his children. He wants us to know him as our true Father and ourselves as his loved and precious children. God intends to share his very self with us and to enable us to enjoy family relationship with him
and each other.
And with each other.
And that's also, this great privilege of being a child of God means that we are also brothers and sisters. And a lot of churches still refer to each other as brothers and sisters, brother so-and-so, brother Dave, brother Pete, sister Kaz or whatever. And that's because, really at its essence, the church should be like a family. Not like a family, it is a family.
And that's what he's always purposed for us. That's why he created us in the first place. It was for relationship. And this is where we need to begin to understand a theology of ministry. God's purpose for humanity is essentially relational with him. He is healing and transforming us so that we can be with him and enjoy a relationship of love with him forever. Therefore, the tasks of ministry, whatever they might be, needs to be to serve or feed this purpose of growing up into this relationship with God that he gives us in Christ. Ministry is not primarily to entertain or create good servants or to establish an expanding program, but to serve others in such a way that invites them in and enables them to live more and more fully in a dynamic, trusting relationship with our God through Christ.
And with each other. So it's not this, so the ministry isn't, as you said, it's not just to put on an entertainment on a Sunday morning. It's to create a community of faith, a family of God that is 24/7, where we ring in each other, having coffees with each other, where we love one another, we support one another, we're there for one another when there's challenges in life, or there's sickness, or there's poverty, or whatever. We can support one another, and we can celebrate with one another. You know, Eric is turning 99 on Saturday. Happy birthday for Saturday, Eric. And you know, in a year's time, we're going to have a massive celebration when he turns 100, and like we did for Lois, and you know, we got this great family, and that's what church really should be. It's a shame that in some places church has become just an entertainment venue where, you know, people go along and or they just watch something online, which is, it's great if that's all you can do, but it's not a substitute for true family.
Or a ritual.
Right. Or a ritual, a liturgy that has no real meaning to, no ability to bring us into this relationship as you're talking about. So ministry, as you said, exists to facilitate that relationship both with God and with each other. So now you know, go get them, Tiger. Have a great week, and serve one another in love.